Greetings, everyone. This is MareBear62990 back with another top 10 list. If you haven't seen my list of the top 10 SpongeBob episodes considered the worst, what I did in that video was to tell you guys the 10 worst SpongeBob episodes overall according to TV.com ratings and give you my thoughts on the episodes. This video is going to be very similar to that, only this time I'm limiting it to episodes that aired in seasons 1 through 3, before the 2004 movie. So, without further ado, this is the top 10 pre-movie SpongeBob episodes considered the worst. Number 10. Nature Pants. Out of all the episodes on this list, this is probably the one I was most surprised to see on here. It seems to be a relatively well-received episode based on the reviews posted on TV.com, despite overall being voted one of the lower-rated Season 1 episodes. Now, that being said, I didn't think this was a great episode. I guess for what it was decent. I mean, there wasn't anything particularly bad about it, but there wasn't anything particularly good either. Except maybe the scenes that had Patrick. I thought those were pretty funny. For the most part, though, this episode bored me and didn't really hold my attention, to be honest. So yeah, I wouldn't call it bad, but it's not one of the better Season 1 episodes. Number 9. I'm with Stupid. This episode seems to get a lot of hatred because of Patrick being a jerk to SpongeBob near the end. And while I do agree it does get kind of mean-spirited toward the end, at least Patrick being a jerk somewhat affects the story and drives the plot forward. There were also some pretty good jokes in this episode, like the letter and note joke near the beginning, and all the stupid things SpongeBob did to make Patrick look smart were pretty funny. This episode does get a little annoying at a couple parts, but I can forgive that. Oh, and one more thing I should add. We learned something about the show in general from this episode. That starfish aren't too bright. But I guess that makes sense, because there's probably no room for brains in those pointy heads of theirs. Number 8. Squirrel Jokes. When I first saw this episode a long time ago, I loved it and thought it was one of the best I'd seen. Looking back, though, I would probably categorize this episode merely as pretty good. Not great. I can kind of see why this episode is panned by some, because like the aforementioned I'm with Stupid, it does get a little cruel with SpongeBob making those jokes about Sandy. The ending was relatively satisfying, though, and the final line was pretty funny. There were some other pretty decent jokes in this episode, too, although a few of them fell flat, like Sandy acting stupid near the end. For the most part, I enjoyed this episode, though, but I can understand why a lot of other people didn't. Number 7. Bossy Boots. Out of all the episodes on this list, this is one of the few I actually thought was pretty great. I guess I can understand to a degree why some people didn't like it. They might have found it boring or just really dislike episodes with Pearl. I thought there were some great jokes in this episode, like SpongeBob saying, "Hello, Paul," when Pearl first comes in, and his reaction when he sees Mr. Krabs passed out on the floor. My favorite joke, though, is probably when SpongeBob is standing outside the Krusty Krab in the crab suit, and the guy drives by and he's all like, "Hey buddy, you need a ride? I was just on my way to the Big Doofus convention." I'm not really sure why that made me laugh so hard, but I guess that just goes to show even mean-spirited humor can work sometimes. Number 6. Hooky. This is another one of those episodes that I would categorize as good, but not great. I mean, at worst it was mediocre, but at best it was good. A lot of people criticized this episode for the ending, but I didn't think it was that bad. SpongeBob learned his lesson at the end, and the episode itself had a pretty good moral. That you should try hard to resist temptation and always respect and obey your elders. Humor-wise, though, it wasn't that good. There were a couple parts that got a laugh out of me, like the mayonnaise joke and SpongeBob repeating everything Mr. Krabs. For the most part, though, this episode wasn't that funny. I guess the main problem with this one, though, is that most of it just wasn't memorable. But I guess there wasn't anything really terrible about it. Number 5. Partypooper Pants, aka SpongeBob's House Party. I remember years ago when this episode came out, Nickelodeon promoted it like crazy, and Wendy's even had a toy license just for this particular episode. Personally, I thought it was great, and one of my favorites of Season 3. In fact, this is probably my favorite episode on this list. The jokes were great for the most part, like Patrick's part and Miss Puff seeing SpongeBob's face in the window and thinking it was just a painting. The song at the end was also really good. Yeah, I'll admit it didn't make very much sense that SpongeBob got arrested just because he didn't invite the police officers to the party. But that's really just a nitpick for me, and I get that it was supposed to be a joke. A lot of people complain about the patchy segments in this episode, but I didn't really mind those either. So overall, I wouldn't say this was one of my favorites, but I really enjoyed it, and I don't think it was anywhere near as bad as a lot of people claim. Number 4, Sandis Rocket. I'm drawing a blank here. That shows how little I really have to say about this episode. There isn't really anything humorous about it except for maybe Patrick playing in the rocket, but that doesn't mean this episode was terrible. It was just forgettable. I guess the premise wasn't that bad, but it seems like something that's been done on a lot of other shows. In fact, season 8 of the show has an episode that's sort of like this one. So, overall, this wasn't a bad episode by any means, but I would only watch it if there was nothing better on TV. Number 3, Squeaky Boots. This was another episode I actually really liked. A lot of people thought it was annoying, and I can see why. I did find it a little annoying at some parts, but for the most part it was really funny. I actually found it hilarious watching Mr. Krabs go crazy in this episode, especially when he eats the boots at the end. The scene at his house when he can't get the window shut was also really funny. The storyline was actually also pretty decent, and it was a nice introduction to Pearl. Number 2, The Sponge Who Could Fly, aka The Lost Episode. Out of all the episodes on this list, this is the only one that I genuinely disliked. In fact, it's probably the worst out of all the preview movie episodes in my opinion. For one, I hardly found any of the jokes funny except SpongeBob's attempts to fly, and the video of the walk cycles near the beginning. Patrick flying away at the end was also kind of funny. The thing I really couldn't stand about this episode, though, is how everyone treated SpongeBob. I didn't like how they made fun of him just for having a dream and how they said he owed them favors even though he clearly didn't. The patchy segments were pretty unnecessary in this episode too, and this was one of the few times they actually really irritated me. I can't really put my finger on why though. So overall, I wasn't really surprised to see this one on the list at all, and I could definitely understand why a lot of people don't like it. As for the musical numbers, I didn't mind them all that much, although I typically don't care for episodes where the characters burst into song. And now for the number 1 pre-movie SpongeBob episode considered the worst. Ugh, aka Spongebob BC. This is another one where I can sort of understand why it's generally panned, but I didn't think it was all that bad. I liked the premise and thought it was a creative idea. However, for me, it didn't live up to its full potential. I mean, it was an alright special for the most part, but for the majority of the episode, it doesn't really feel like that much happens. It's basically just the characters discovering fire and fighting over it. And that's really it, at least for the animated segments. I also felt like there were some parts that dragged on, especially when they first discover the fire. The patchy segments were actually pretty decent here, and I liked the song at the end. So overall, it was an okay special at best. Well, folks, there you have it. Be sure to let me know what you think of this list in the comments. And I'm curious to know, which pre-movie SpongeBobs do you think belong on a top 10 worst list? This is MareBear62990, signing out.